Welcome, everyone. My name is Stacy Blakeley, and I am proud to be the CEO of the Policy Circle. If you don't know anything about the Policy Circle, I'd love to share a few things with you. First, our mission is to inform, equip, and connect women to be more impactful citizens. And really, one of the ways that we inform is through our policy briefs and our programming. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have today because in this election season, we find there is so much information, there's overload, but there's also enormous distrust. And one of the topics that we're going to delve into today is polling, which I think many of us have mixed reviews on polls in the last couple of years, but it's a vital part of our political process and really taking the public's temperature on an issue and on a candidate. So we're really going to explore the role that polling plays in the media landscape and really how can civically engaged Americans utilize polling to make their decisions and do so with trust and an understanding of how the polling works. So I can think of no better person to help us wade through what might be some muddy waters than Scott Rasmussen. Scott is the president of RMG Research. He is a pioneer in the field of automated polling, and 20 years ago, he released the first ever daily presidential tracking poll. And the Washington Post called Scott a driving force in American politics, and the Wall Street Journal described him as a key player in the contact sport of politics. So I'm excited to welcome Scott today so he can help coach us through this contact sport of politics and polling and how we as citizens can just be better informed to navigate this. Scott, welcome.
Well, Stacy, it's great to be with you. And this is an amazing topic because when I started in this business, which was many decades ago, I hate to admit, there wasn't all that much polling and normal people didn't talk about it that much. But it's become such a part of the landscape that it's really good to have a discussion like this.
Well, I certainly appreciate that because you're right. I think that every time I'm reading news stories, like a new poll, and there's a new one. And I think deciphering this mountain of data and oftentimes very conflicting polling results, just it's really tough. So I'd love if you would sort of explain, how you got into this and really kind of what sets your approach to polling perhaps apart from this, now we've got so many folks in this field. Would love to hear more about your approach in particular.
Well, I got into it because from way back, I'm a numbers geek. I'm one of those people I can look at numbers and they tell me a story. It took me a while to realize that normal people, their eyes glaze over when you get into this. But that was who I was. That's how I grew up. And when I was in high school, I had a chance to spend about an hour with Joe Napolitan, who was a legendary pollster. And he worked for John F. Kennedy in the presidential campaign, worked for Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey. And the more I look back on it, I just really am amazed that he gave an hour of his time to a stupid high school kid talking about these things. But one of the things that he talked about was you should never underestimate the intelligence of the American people. But at the same time, you should never overestimate their level of political knowledge. And I think that's really key. A lot of pollsters today, I think, believe people are stupid. And a lot of people in the political world think the rest of the country is hanging on every word that comes out of Washington. The reality is only about 8% of voters talk politics on a daily basis through most of the year. And even now, at the peak of this election season, only about 16% of voters, 1 out of 6, are talking politics on a daily basis. So you've got to keep that separate. You've got to remember that if you're not talking politics daily, you're not using the same language that people who are in that bubble are talking. And it's important to decipher that.
I think that's such a good point. One of the things we talk about frequently at the Policy Circle is the power of definitions, because terminology gets thrown around and then it's sort of baked into a narrative and nobody ever took the time to stop and say, well, what do you actually mean by that? And are we using the same term but in very different ways? So I love that you want us to start there and understand fundamentally where are people and what is their knowledge base. And so that brings me to a question in terms of polling. And I think the trust in polling is probably greatly declined, especially after 2016, 2020, and even the midterm, the red wave and the things that didn't materialize. Help us understand, like, what are the most important factors for us when we start looking at whether or not a poll is reliable?
Well, let's start by separating. There's two kinds of polls that you're throwing into the mix here. There are policy polls trying to measure the attitudes of people. And the biggest thing to look for in those polls is always the question wording. What are they asking? This gets back to the definition question. If you're in the political bubble, terms like woke and CRT and DEI have a very particular meaning. We've gone out and asked voters if they know what those terms mean. And some, depending on the term that I just mentioned, there are like 12 or 16% of voters know what those terms mean. So imagine that you ask a polling question about being woke and only 16% of voters know what it means. And then you interpret the results assuming they all know what it meant. That's a big problem.
Right.
So the language on the policy questions is really, really important. It's something that gets lost in the shuffle here. When you talk about election polls, it's a whole different game. For the most part, just about all pollsters ask very similar versions of the same question. If the election were held today, would you vote for candidate A or candidate B? And sometimes you throw in a third party candidate and there may be other mixes. But what's difficult is to tell who's actually going to show up and vote. We're releasing a poll of Pennsylvania voters tomorrow, and it's showing the race is tied. Well, what that really tells us is in Pennsylvania, if people are motivated a little more than we expect to vote for Donald Trump, well, he's probably going to win. If they're motivated a little bit more in the other way than we're estimating, well, then she's going to win. How do you evaluate that as a consumer? Number one, look at the averages. Too many people tell me, well, I like this poll. And usually what they mean by that is because it shows my team winning.
Right.
Look at the averages, pay especially close attention to the polls that you don't like. Don't throw them out. And then remember that polls are good at giving a sense of the race, but they are not a precision tool. Right now, if you were to take the polling averages in all 7 swing states, and you were to shift them 1 point, just 1 point in Kamala Harris's direction, she would win just about all 7 of those states and have a big electoral college victory. If you were to shift them all in Donald Trump's direction, well, the same thing. He would win most of those states and he would have a big electoral college victory. That's a 1 point difference. And polls have about a 3-point margin of error. So what does it tell me when I look at those averages? The race is too close to call. Nobody knows who's going to win. And you just have to accept that.
Oh, accepting that is the challenge, Scott.
It is.
So talk to me about, and you could even probably give me a sense of how this has changed over time. But we know folks don't like it when you say it's too close to call, or even worse, right? If you show the other team in your poll is got the advantage. Talk to me about what it's like to do the work you're doing, analyze the data, put the data out there, and then it's immediately either discredited or there's enormous distrust. I mean, what are you facing with that, especially in this election cycle?
Well, look, first off, if you're in this business, you have to have a thick skin, because whenever you put out a poll that somebody doesn't like, if you show a Democrat doing better, well, then you're called, a Marxist or something. If you show a Republican doing better, you're MAGA. And, you accept that. You try to help people understand what's going on in the best sense that you can. And you also point out the reality. So when I say the race is too close to call right now, I know from our own polling that about 90% of Trump voters think he is likely to win. About 90% of Harris voters think she is likely to win. And what's happening is these people are looking at the race and they're projecting what they think is going to happen. So if you're a Harris supporter and you look at these polls being very close, you'll say something like, well, people don't really know her yet. And as they come to understand her positions on these issues, as they come to hear more about what a crazy guy Trump is, they're going to change their mind. If you're a Trump voter, you're saying the exact opposite. The more people learn about Vice President Harris, the more they're going to be supporters for Trump. And think about it. I mean, look, if you're a sports fan, you go to a game and you always believe your team can win.
Yeah.
Because our players are clear on this guy's going to come through in the clutch. This is going to happen. Well, that's being a fan, not being an analyst.
Well, and that's only true if you're not a Dallas Cowboys fan right now, but I'm just going to leave that right there.
Yeah, I'm a New York Giants fan.
Living in Dallas, we're feeling a little depressed. Yeah. So I think that you bring up something else that I think often gets confusing for people, and without confusing us more, Scott, how do we factor in the margin of error? Because these are so close. And I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole trying to understand this. And I'm one of those people that you start getting into the different models and I'm like, whoa. But I do think it's important for us to understand how that margin of error factors in to the poll results. So can you give us a little explainer?
So in theory, if you were able to conduct a perfect poll of 1,000 voters, a perfectly representative sample, and there were only two choices involved, the margin of error would say, if you do this perfectly 1,000 times, the results are going to be within about 3 points every single time, or 95 times out of 100, just about every time.
Okay.
So the margin of error is saying, even if you do everything perfectly, you can't really count on the results. One way to think of it, I don't recommend this, but if you sit down and toss a coin 1,000 times in a row, it's likely to be between about 470 heads and 530 heads just about every time, because it's a 50-50 proposition. What that leaves out are other questions. Who is going to turn out to vote? I mean, these are difficult questions. Who are you? What other sources of error might there be? Sometimes candidates' names are different than what they're officially on the ballot. How might that factor into something? And just to give you a sense of how confusing this is, if I ask a voter, how likely are you to vote in this election? And you say you're definitely going to vote. We know from comparing what people tell us to actual voting records that only about 80% of people who say they're definitely going to vote actually vote. And at the other end, people who say they're not very likely to vote, some of them show up every time. So you need to factor in a little bit of, just a fudge factor. You don't try to quantify it. You say, look, again, what I said earlier, if the polls showing this to be a toss-up, think about what would it look like if they shifted 1 or 2 points in this direction or 1 or 2 points in that direction. And that's a good way to think about this always. And also sometimes we think this is a static process. You look at the candidates, you make up your mind. Well, actually, some people are trying to decide if they want to vote at all. Is it worth it? I don't like either of them. Sometimes big things come into play. Maybe there will be an event in the Middle East or campus protests or something with the economy that'll change people's mind between now and when they vote. Sometimes it's very small things. In 2008, we were polling in a primary in South Carolina between Mike Huckabee and John McCain. We're very close down the stretch.
Okay.
Well, it snowed in the mountains, which was Huckabee territory. It was nice at the beach, which was McCain territory. So Huckabee's voters were more likely to stay home. McCain won and then became the nominee. Again, we can't predict the weather. So when you're looking ahead to Election Day, recognize that there's not a lot of precision right now. The only time you have precision is when, like 40 years ago, Ronald Reagan won 49 states. You can be pretty clear what was going to happen then. But most of the time, it's not that clear cut.
We haven't seen that clarity in a long time.
A very long time.
So I think that's really helpful in terms of understanding. I mean, it's a human element. I mean, there is a
Right.
human element to this, even though there's science and math models and everything else. There's the human element, and then there's all these factors that you just mentioned outside your control. Have y'all taken a poll recently of people saying whether or not they plan to vote or sit it out?
Oh, we do that 3 times a week.
Okay.
Um, and you have to factor this into the reality of what's going to happen. And what we're finding, there's been an interesting shift. When it was Trump versus Biden, the larger the pool of voters, in other words, if you expanded to people who said, well, I might vote, the better it was for Biden. Now we're finding the reverse with Harris. Is that real? I don't know. But it does give you a sense of the enthusiasm and, some of the factors that come in. There's also things that go into effect that and I apologize for getting into probably too much down a rabbit hole with this. People with a postgraduate degree are far more likely to tell us they're going to show up and vote. And that's partly reflective of reality. They do tend to show up more and vote.
Okay.
People in the most rural areas probably understate their voting intentions or expectations. So you have to try and balance that out. And the reason that when you start talking about these things, the education gap, for example, people with a postgraduate degree are planning to vote overwhelmingly for Vice President Harris. People who have a bachelor's degree but not a postgraduate degree are leaning just a little bit in Harris's direction. People who don't have a degree at all are leaning a little bit in Trump's direction. So if you have too many people who say have a postgraduate degree, your numbers are going to overstate Harris's prospects. And again, we don't know the perfect answers to who's actually going to show up, but we're doing our best to estimate it.
You bring something up that I'm always curious about, and that's the sample. And
Yep.
it's how you identify representative groups, how you go about getting folks to self-identify in certain ways. And so talk to me about the sample size, because I always look to see how many people are surveyed. And I'm always interested in the volume, but there's so much more to it than that. So help us understand that process.
So let's start with a simple fact. If 1,000 people are surveyed, that should give you, if it's a good sample, that should give you a reasonable sense of the overall outcome, that 3% margin of error range. When you begin to split that into smaller groups, well, you're dealing with smaller and smaller sample sizes. So if you have 1,000 voters, you're going to have just over 500 women and just under 500 men. So if you start comparing men to women, you're dealing with a smaller sample size. Oh, and you're probably only going to have about 117 black voters in that sample. Oh, so if you're only talking about black voters, well, that's a really small sample you're dealing with. So when you ask about sample size, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. A sample size of 1,000 voters gives you a good overall number, but you should never go down the rabbit holes of saying, wait a minute, this poll understated black support by 10 points, therefore I'm going to adjust it because the sample sizes of those subsets are too small. When you're starting to talk about special surveys of some of those groups, it's important. Sometimes you do have to just oversample black voters, or some people have been oversampling Jewish voters in this cycle because of some of the issues that are out there. So that's the size is one part of it, and then the composition is the other. We check a lot of variables to make sure we have a good sample. And one of them is to make sure we have the right mix of people who have a postgraduate degree, a bachelor's degree, went to some college, but have not finished, and then who have never been to college. We also do something, and I think we're a little bit unique in this, with what we call population density.
Mm-hmm.
So we look at because when we survey you, we get your zip code. We know where you live. And we want to make sure we have a right mix of people who say live in high population density areas, 10,000 people per square mile or more,
Mm-hmm.
and how many live in very low population density areas, people with fewer than 250 people per square mile. You always, again, we can never get a perfect sample, but we look at what we think are the distinct variables and where we're likely to miss people or have too many people come in, and make sure you balance those out properly. And sometimes in elections, you find that there were surprises in who you expected to show up, but that's part of the learning curve.
Okay.
But Stacey, I want to jump into one other thing that we haven't touched on that I think is really important in all this. Doing a good poll is half the battle. Analyzing the poll, determining what it means, is the other half.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where, in social media, people attack polls they don't like. But it really is a serious problem. In 2016, despite all the legends and myths that are out there, the polling was actually pretty good. The national polling average in that year, in 2016, showed that Hillary Clinton would win the popular vote by 3. She won by 2.
Mm.
There were 47 states where there were no surprises, where the polling made it very clear who was going to win. There were 3 surprises, 3 blue wall states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Well, Wisconsin was way off. That was a big polling miss.
Right.
But Michigan and Pennsylvania, the final polling averages were within the margin of error, and Trump led the last poll in both of those states. So a reasonable analysis would have said it's easy to see how Donald Trump gets to 263 votes.
Okay.
If he wins either of these 2 toss-up states, he could be the next president. But the idea of Donald Trump winning was so foreign to political analysts, they couldn't do it. I was in Fox News the morning of that election, and all the talk was, well, yeah, she's up 3 points in the polls, but there's a margin of error. She's probably going to win by 6. So the analysis was bad, even though the polls were good. And I think the analysis, we all see things through the eyes of who we want to win or expect to win. And you really have to discipline yourself to look at the other side, to look at all the reasons you might be wrong in your assessment.
I think that's so interesting too. And I find that a headline can be extremely misleading about what the poll reveals. And sometimes, of course, it's just to get the clicks. But to your point, they're looking for what they want to extract from those polling results versus allowing the pollster, to give the analysis. You get just raw results, it feels like, and then you have somebody off to the races spinning that how they want to spin it. So that brings me back to something you said earlier about, I don't trust a poll from this group. I think they're biased, or, I don't trust, people have this preconceived notion. Just to your point, there's a narrative around 2016 that's totally inaccurate and whatever else. How do we, as good consumers of news and of citizens who want to make some decisions based on, I don't know, actual facts, novel concept, how do we decipher, which are the surveys out there that you would say, hey, look at these 3 or 4 and then come to your own conclusion? Or are there other sources besides the work you're doing, Scott, and you think, okay, this place typically gives you the information without skewing the results? Do you have other folks out there that you think are trustworthy, at least to bring into the mix?
Well, so I would start by saying, if I'm talking about polling in terms of who's going to win an election, I would rely on the averages of Real Clear Politics and 538.
Okay.
Just go to the averages. And you know what? They're going to include some polls that I don't think are great and that you might not think are great. But the averages work out. You've got to have some of those outliers in the mix. That's just part of the process. If you're looking for information on the election, I would go to Ballotpedia. It's the Encyclopedia of American Politics. And full disclosure, I'm an editor at large there. But it's just about the only political site that has a representative share of Republicans, Democrats, and independents. It gives you information about the elections as you're going forward. If you're talking about how do you act as a consumer, I would encourage the first thing that you do is to acknowledge that people can disagree with you without being stupid and without being your enemy. And you laugh at that.
No, but it's true.
We did a poll recently, and only 13% of Kamala Harris voters can understand how a reasonable person would even consider voting for Donald Trump. And the numbers of Trump on Trump's side, thinking about that, with how could a reasonable person, support Harris, are about the same. If you can't understand, if you say to support the other person is unreasonable, you've already lost your fight to be a good observer. Think about what they might see. I can give you plenty of reasons to vote for or against both of those candidates. I can give you analytical reasons as to what people see. I can look at different issues. But the most important thing is put yourself in a position of saying, okay, Stacy, you have this crazy view on this issue that doesn't make sense to me, but I want to try to understand why you think that way. And if you do that, I think that's a first step, not just towards better understanding of polls, but of healing a little bit of our political system.
Well, and that's exactly what the policy circle is meant to do, is to gather people, to have conversations rooted in fact. And even if you disagree, there's such value in understanding how people land on a candidate, how they feel about a particular ballot initiative or a public policy issue. And we're losing that art of conversation, that it doesn't devolve into personal attacks and some of the things that we see the minute somebody thinks you're in the other camp, which is really upsetting. I'd say one other thing I'd love to hear from you, Scott, is in this last, maybe even this election cycle, has there been a poll result where you thought, wow, I didn't see that coming, or this is really not what I expected to see? Have you had anything surprising recently?
There are always surprises. Some of them are discouraging surprises. Some of them seem to make sense. For example, we did a poll before the presidential debate of likely debate watchers. And these are people who knew the debate was scheduled and they're definitely going to watch. And just 1% of them were uncommitted.
Wow.
Everybody was. So the people watching the debate, they weren't looking to evaluate a candidate. They were cheering. It was like going to an Ohio State-Michigan football game. You go there to root for your team. So that was surprising in a discouraging way. And it also brought forth something that, we forget how much things have changed. In 1980, 94% of voters watched the Reagan-Carter debate. Only about a third of voters watched the Trump-Harris debate. What that meant was, in Reagan's time, 40 years ago, or longer than that now, 44 years ago, everybody was watching, including swing voters. Now it's, again, only the fans cheering for their team are watching, and so it's a different dynamic. And the other, I'll end with a good surprise.
Good.
Martin Luther King Jr., his last book, he was really writing about, it was called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And he was writing about one of the challenges that he saw, which was that by the late 60s, a lot of the Black community in America was feeling that nothing had been accomplished. And a lot of people in the white community were saying, oh, we've achieved equality. Everybody can vote now. And he was saying neither of those was right. You need to continue to make progress. You need to acknowledge we've made progress, but there's more to do. And in that, he cited some polling data that in 1966, 88% of white parents would have been troubled if their child dated somebody who's Black. And 80% would have been concerned if a friend of theirs married a Black person. And 50% of white Americans would have been offended if a Black person lived next to them. This is 1966. Hard to, just by your reaction, we can't even imagine that world today.
Yeah.
Well, today, only 16% of white parents would be concerned if their child dated a black person. Only 11% would be concerned if a close friend or family member married someone of a different race. And only 2% would be offended if a black person moved in next to them. Now, I'd like all those numbers to be zero.
Sure.
But you have to, when you go from 88% being concerned about dating a black person to 16%, that's real progress. Doesn't mean we're all the way there. And in fact, most people, about half of all Americans, say we're not there yet, but our country is moving in that direction. And I think that's very good. And the final piece of that poll that was really encouraging to me, a lot of conservatives like to quote Martin Luther King in his call for a colorblind society, judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And they like to forget other parts of Dr. King's message. But he also talked about the need to help all poor people, to lift people out of poverty, white and black people. And he was trying to draw this attention to this idea that rather than a racial divide, something else is going on. Well, in our polling, we found out that more than 60% of voters think that a poor white person has more in common with a poor black person today than they would with a rich white person. That economic differentiator is recognized, and that's an improvement. And now we have to do something about it, but at least when people are aware of it. So I take all of that, not to say we've solved our racial problems, but to say there is some good news and there's also work to be done.
I think that confirms the pursuit of a more perfect union. We're still en route and still have plenty of work to do. Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think it's important as we, start to dissect polls and we get perhaps hung up in some of the smaller details of this. I think sort of zooming out a little bit is really important. And so I really appreciate this conversation. Our community is hungry for facts and for engaging on the issues. And I think it's important that they look at the polls and they bake that in to their analysis. And hopefully we're actually considering other factors and not just rooting for our team. There's got to be some critical thought in there too. So I really appreciate the work that you do, Scott. And I really appreciate too how thoughtful you are in this process, especially about the way you ask questions and the transparency of the work you do. I think that's a big key factor. So we are grateful to you. Thank you for spending time breaking this down for us today. I think we've all left knowing we need to go look at this in aggregate and take the bigger picture in mind. So we really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Well, thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And you can find all of our polling at napolitannews.org. So you can go and look at our stuff. And if you like the results you see, well, still check all the other polls, because it's important that you do that.
All right. We're going to dig in. Thanks again. Right. And buckle your seatbelt for this fun, 5 weeks we have ahead.
Fun is not the word I would use, but we will all get through it together.
All right. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Well, that conversation with Scott was so interesting to me, because we are in this time where if someone doesn't like the results, they start to attack whoever put those materials and the data together. It's so important for us as citizens to be informed and discerning. And so the Policy Circle is here to help provide you with a wide range of tools and resources so that you can gather the facts, analyze the issues and the candidates, and make up your own mind. So if you value the work that the Policy Circle is doing to boost civil discourse and informed civic engagement, we would certainly appreciate it if you would support our mission. If you'll go to thepolicycircle.org and click donate, we would greatly appreciate your support as we continue to build this organization, as we continue to impact more individuals all around our country, to empower them to step into the gap, to take on leadership roles, and to be constructive and positive influence on the community around them. So we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining. Please share this on your social network, and we would love to have you join the Policy Circle community. Thanks, and have a great day.